London, 1896, and the police are keeping busy fighting crime and frequently capturing the culprits. An example of their efforts is illustrated by events on the morning of June the 9th, as it's an execution, more specifically, a triple execution. Its claim to fame on that Tuesday was that it was the last triple hanging at Newgate Prison. Over the centuries, countless people were executed in London, and simultaneous multiple executions were par for the course. Tyburn Tree, as the gallows were nicknamed, could do 6 or more at a time. So what is it about the execution of Henry Fowler, Albert Milsom, and William Seaman, and their terrible crimes as well? There was a lot of press coverage at the time about their trials and execution that kept the public riveted. At the time, Muswell Hill was a wealthy neighbourhood in North London and was home to 80-year-old Henry Smith, who lived there in a large house called Muswell Lodge. Smith was somewhat reclusive, and rumour had it he was a wealthy miser, keeping large sums of money in the house. He lived alone, though he had a gardener and a couple of maids in the daytime. There had been a number of burglaries in the area in the past, and Smith had taken precautions to help prevent any break-ins. His body was discovered on the morning of the 14th of February by his gardener, Charles Webber, a few hours after his murder. Webber alerted Smith's neighbours, called in a local doctor, and notified the police. When they arrived, they found that the back door had been forced, and in the kitchen, Smith had been tied up with rope and had sustained several head wounds from a crowbar after what appeared to be a violent struggle. He had been brutally beaten and had evidently died from his wounds. 2 pocket knives and a lantern were found next to the body. The house had been ransacked, and in his bedroom, Smith's safe had been opened and emptied, and the room had been torn apart. The day before the murder, 2 men had been seen lurking near the house. For weeks, the police tried to find the killers, using the lantern as the best clue they had. Unfortunately, hundreds were in existence, so it was a clue that might never be traced. Instead, a detective named William Burrell knew about a burglar named Albert Milsom, who had disappeared from his neighbourhood. Milsom had recently been seen in the company of a man called Henry Fowler. Burrell was aware of the younger brother-in-law of Milsom, reportedly having a similar lantern, but knew he could not question him or other members of the family about it without tipping them off about its significance. A trap was set at a nearby sweet shop, where the lantern was set up. The trap succeeded when Milsom's brother-in-law, Henry Miller, identified the lantern as his own. Now that they were aware that it was Milsom whom they wanted, and that Fowler was missing as well, the police started an immediate manhunt. It eventually turned out that the men were together in a small travelling show that journeyed to fairs around the country, with Fowler acting as a strongman in one of the acts. A police raid captured both men in Bath. Milsom gave up meekly, but Fowler fought back and had to be forcibly restrained. When they were arrested, they had loaded revolvers with them. Both were in their early 30s and said that they were both labourers and of no fixed abode. Fowler and Milsom had brought new clothes and boots, paid for with gold pieces. Fowler denied knowing anything about the murder, but Milsom soon cracked under the strain and confessed to robbing Smith, although he said his partner in crime had done the killing. Their trial was held at the Old Bailey. The evidence was streamlined because of Milsom's confession, although Fowler kept denying its truth. Trying to save his own skin, Milsom turned Queen's evidence. He confessed that he and Fowler had committed the burglary and robbery, but he said he had no part in the murder and that Fowler alone was responsible for it. He was living in hope that would help him to get his sentence commuted. It didn't. During a break in the trial, Fowler suddenly jumped up into the dock and started throttling Milsom. A number of policemen rushed over and pulled Fowler off the cowering Milsom. The evidence had shown 2 knives near the dead Smith, suggested that the burglars had jointly committed the tying up and killing of the victim. Milsom collapsed when he heard the guilty verdict against him. Fowler just laughed at the failure of Milsom's scheme and mimicked his partner's protesting of the verdict. When asked if they had anything further to say, Fowler told the court that there were 2 miscarriages of justice for which he was responsible, naming 2 recent convictions of 2 burglars for whose crimes Fowler claimed responsibility. He asked the court to keep these in mind for reviewing those 2 sentences. As it turned out, Fowler was lying. The evidence against the 2 burglars was stronger than Fowler thought, and they, as it turned out, were friends of his, whom he was trying to do a favour. Milsom and Fowler were both sentenced to death. The authorities were afraid that when the pair were going to be hanged, Fowler might attack Milsom again. It was decided to hang the 2 men with a 3rd one in between them to prevent any altercation. That 3rd person was responsible for a recent double murder that had been committed in the Whitechapel area of London, of a pawnbroker named John Levy, aged 75, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Sarah Gale, aged 37. The double murders came as shocking news. It had only been 6 weeks since Mr. Levy, who was well known in the neighbourhood, had retired and handed over the business to his stepson, who was the offspring of his deceased wife's first marriage. He seems to have been, from all accounts, a very popular person in the surrounding district and known to be quite well off. According to the neighbours, it was well known that the elderly Mr. Levy kept a considerable amount of valuable property, including gold and jewellery, in the house, and over the last several weeks, the house was reported to have had several attempted break-ins, although those efforts were not rewarded. The first suspicion that something was wrong was shortly before 1 o'clock on Saturday morning. Mrs. Lawton, a cousin of the deceased man, who lived in the same street, went round to the house following an invitation to dine with her relative. Much to her astonishment, she remained knocking at the door for some minutes without any response being forthcoming, and then a strange feeling came over her that something was wrong. The loud and constant knocking attracted the attention of the next-door neighbour, a tailor named William Schaefer, who went out to see what the matter was. Mrs. Lawton told him she was unable to get any response and suggested that he should go to his backyard and see if he could ascertain anything by getting over the wall and having a look. When Schaefer got into his neighbour's back garden, he was astonished to see through the window in the back door the head of a strange man in a brown cloth cap inside the house. He shouted out to the stranger, who immediately disappeared from view, only to reappear a few minutes afterwards, when he thought it was all clear, so he could make his escape. When the man made his move, Schaefer confronted him and wanted to know what he was doing there. The stranger retreated back into the house and slammed the door shut. Fully convinced that something wrong had happened, and apprehensive of the worst, Schaefer rushed to his house and made for the street, with a view to alerting the police. The constables on duty in the vicinity were immediately called, and a couple of them, under the guidance of Schaefer, made their way to the back of the house and managed to force open the back door and get into Levi's house. A strict watch was kept on both the front and back to prevent the strange man who had been seen from making his escape. The police, apprehensive that murder had been committed and that the burglars might still be in the house, managed to get a couple of neighbours to help them out, and they then proceeded to search the property. Their worst fears were soon realised, for half concealed behind a door on the ground floor, they discovered the body of Mr. Levy, lying in a pool of blood. His throat had been cut from ear to ear with some sharp instrument, while the back of his skull had been battered in with what appeared to be a hammer. The head and face of the dead man, as well as his clothing, were covered with bloodstains. The features bore an agonized look, though death must have been instantaneous. Continuing their search through the house, the police found drawers ransacked and furniture overturned, while a safe on the first floor, in which Mr. Levy kept much of his valuable property, had its door open. In the back room on the second floor, which was used as a bedroom by the housekeeper, they found stretched on her back on the floor by the side of the bed lay the dead body of Mrs. Gale in a pool of blood, which was streaming in all directions. The woman had been frightfully mutilated. Her head was almost completely separated from her body, while, as in the case of her fellow victim, the skull had been most unmercifully beaten in with a blunt instrument of some kind. It was evident that, although taken by surprise, the housekeeper had fought fiercely for her life, as furniture in the room had been knocked over, while splashes of blood were noted as being on the walls. On the same floor, officers saw a hole in the ceiling giving access to the roof. The laths and plaster had been beaten in with a hammer, and an aperture made sufficiently large for someone to crawl through. While this search had been in progress, extra police had been called to the scene of the tragedy, and the street had rapidly filled with an excited crowd. Just after the officers had discovered the hole in the ceiling, a loud shout came from the street that there was a man on the roof. One constable had just got his body halfway through the hole in the ceiling when he caught sight of a man standing in the guttering, which ran round the roof. The suspect had climbed onto the coping stones, hauling himself over by his hands, and then dropped into the street below, a distance of around 40 feet. On the way down, he unfortunately hit a little girl named Leah Hyams, who was struck on the back by his falling body, who was at the time standing with her mother close to the wall of the house. In trying to escape from the scene, the suspect was seriously injured when he jumped from the roof of the house into the street below. Here he had to be rescued by the police from the clutches of an angry crowd, who had gathered in the street when news of the murders had broken. When he made his desperate escape, he had with him 2 bundles, which apparently contained what he had stolen. Subsequently, when searched by the police, they were found to contain several gold watches, a number of rings and other jewellery, as well as a quantity of money. Other property was also discovered hidden in the pockets of the burglar. All the items were later confirmed to belong to Mr. Levy. As the man struck the pavement with a dull thud, he was at once seized by the police. Since he had sustained some serious injuries and was unconscious, an ambulance was called, and between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the man was taken to the London hospital. On arrival, he received prompt attention and it was ascertained he was suffering from concussion, a fractured right shoulder, and injuries to the right leg. The man remained in an insensible condition throughout the night. It was not until Sunday afternoon that he finally woke up. Even so, the patient was in a very serious condition, although there were hopes of his recovery. He still had not been identified and was estimated to be between 30 and 40 years old. Let's not forget how was the child, Leah, that had been inadvertently injured by the falling criminal. Having been knocked out, she was taken to a neighbour's house to wait for an ambulance. She was taken to hospital and was badly bruised, but was well enough to return home the following day. She still had some pain and was still suffering from fright, but she bounced back and made a full recovery. The police did not know how the house was broken into, as there were no signs of forced entry, either at the front or the back. A clasp knife and a hammer were found on the roof, and both had traces of blood that had been dropped by the burglar when he attempted to escape. Whilst in custody in hospital, the suspect, after a couple of days, was identified by Detective Inspector Marshall of Scotland Yard as one of a daring gang of burglars who had plagued the city for some years. His name was 41-year-old William Seaman, a career criminal. He had several aliases and was known to have committed many notorious robberies and had spent a considerable number of years in prison. He previously had been sentenced at the Old Bailey for robbery with violence, and he had undergone long terms in prison for housebreaking in various parts of the country. It was also thought that Seaman did not work alone and was part of a gang, which was borne out by the fact that it was clearly established after a minute examination of the house and the rooms where the murders were committed that footprints in the attic and on the staircase clearly showed that he had not been alone when the house was broken into, which was consistent with his previous crimes, where he had worked with other criminals. No further arrests were made in the case. There was little doubt that William Seaman had murdered Levy and Annie Gale. He made a pathetic sight when on Friday the 1st of May he appeared at Thames Police Court, still suffering from the injuries he had sustained in the jump from the roof. He had to be carried into court in an armchair where, according to Lloyd's weekly newspaper, who reported that he was evidently suffering from considerable pain. The right sleeve of his coat was empty and pinned against his chest, while his head was supported by a large pillow. He was remanded in custody, and at his subsequent Old Bailey trial on the 18th of May, was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death by the noose. The execution itself was fully reported. It wasn't a public one. That practice had stopped 30 years previously because of the brutalizing effect public executions had on the spectators. The bell of the prison began to toll at 9:15, by which time a huge crowd had gathered outside Newgate Prison. Shortly afterwards, the officials, accompanied by the hangman and his assistants, proceeded to the cells in which the men were confined. They were pinioned, still wearing the clothes in which they were tried. There was then a procession to the scaffold, which was situated in a shed in a yard of the prison. William Seaman was put between Milsom and Fowler on the gallows on the 9th of June. Despite fears by the executioner, John Fowler did not make a scene. He came out onto the scaffold after Milsom and Seaman were set up, asked if Milsom was there, and was satisfied to see he was. Seaman, until then unaware of why he was being placed as he was between the Muswell Hill murderers, said, "Well, this is the first time in my life I've ever been a peacemaker." On the stroke of 9 o'clock, the executioner withdrew the bolt and the drop fell. The execution was over in less than 4 minutes, after the first man was pinioned. Outside, a black flag was run up the prison flagpole. That was the sign that the execution had been carried out, and the crowd raised a cheer when the flag made its appearance. After hanging for an hour, the bodies were cut down and placed in black coffins in the execution shed. At one point, there was a chance that there would have been a quadruple hanging, because Amelia Dyer, the notorious baby farmer, was supposed to be hanged with them. But it was decided that she should be hanged the following day. A question arises as to what happened to the graves of executed convicts when Newgate Prison was demolished 8 years later and replaced with the Central Criminal Court of the Old Bailey that stands there today. The area where the condemned were buried was demolished. The prison's graveyard, located in a passage leading from the jail to the Old Bailey, was under the flagstones and marked with initial letters of the executed prisoners' surnames. This passage, along with the rest of the prison, was removed during the redevelopment.